Okay, so this Commodore 64 has a really weird fault on it. If I hook up a cassette player to it, one of the data sets that Commodore has, and I try to hit play, rewind, or fast forward, it doesn't actually do anything. There's no power going to the data set. However, I know the data set is working because I tried it on another computer. So let's take a look and see if we can figure out what's the problem. So here's when I first got the computer from eBay. And as you can see, I'm first opening it up. I have everything disconnected already. But as I look into it, the board is in really bad shape. And I'm going to give you a close-up of how the board looked. And I don't know if the capacitor was leaking, but it definitely, the whole board seemed damp. And it just seemed like it was in really bad shape. Okay, so when I first tried to turn it on, as you can tell, it did nothing. And that was because there was a couple major problems with it. One of the first problems I had with it was the fact that the clock chip, as you can see here, it's like the newer part. It's like a remake of it. It was actually bad. So I had to actually replace that, and that's the reason why there was no picture or anything, like the video wasn't displaying at all. And then luckily the other problem was very easy to fix, and that was because one of the RAM chips was really hot, like burning hot. So obviously that was a good indication there's probably a short in it, it's bad. So when I replaced that, everything seemed to work. Now, as you can tell on the board, I did quite a bit of other things. For example, I got rid of the RF modulator and got more of a modern replacement, because this board here is just kind of one where I know it had a lot of problems. So bringing it back to life was great, but I wanted to kind of experiment with it and try different things with it, because I have another Commodore 64C that's one I had from childhood. And also you can see I put a mod on it, so I have Jiffy DOS with the switch so I can flip between, and I put heat sinks on it and everything. Oh, and also I replaced the capacitors because they didn't look like they were in good shape. So one of the first things I did to try to look into how this worked is I looked at the pinout of the cassette port itself. As you can see, you got ground, 5 volts, and C3 there is the main one that I'm going to focus on, which is the cassette motor, meaning that no matter which button I press, play, rewind, fast forward, nothing really did anything. Nothing drove the tape player, even though I knew that the tape player actually worked. So the next thing I was like, okay, well, what's going on? Where's this coming from? I hope the CPU's not bad. So I looked up the specs of the CPU, and the main pins that I'm going to focus on are pins 24, 25, and 26, which are more for what we're going to look at for trying to resolve the issue with the motor. Okay, so taking the board apart, first thing I did was I looked for continuity between the CPU and the cassette port to see what was going on with it, to make sure, hey, is it getting connection? And the pins 24, 25, 26 are the main ones that I'm looking at. And as you can see, just going through, checking to make sure that there is continuity. And it didn't really quite tell me exactly what I wanted to know. So I switched over and checked the voltage at that point. And I wanted to see what the voltage was coming out of the CPU, because maybe the CPU was bad. Maybe that part of the CPU wasn't functioning correctly. So I'm going to just touch ground, and then I'm going to just look at the voltage on that cartridge, that cassette port. You can see right here we got 5 volts. 5 volts. And 5 volts. But on the motor, we don't have anything. It just goes down to nothing. So I know that's a problem. Then I'm checking the pin on the CPU. It's at 3 volts, which is good. So it should drop down to 0 if I hit one of the buttons on the cassette player. And that would drive it down to 0 and then trigger everything. So next I'm just going to look to see, okay, coming from that cassette port right there, is it actually connected? Is there a short somewhere, something going on? Look through. And I can see it's good on that side. It's coming through. It goes through that resistor to that power regulator there, the voltage regulator. And now I'm going to look on the other side from the CPU. And I'm going to try to see if there's like a break somewhere in there. So somewhere between the circuitry of the CPU to that little port, there's a problem. And this is what I'm trying to figure out at this point. What's going on with it? I can see it's coming here, so it's going through that little resistor. And I'm starting to think this transistor here may be bad. But that's a part that I'm starting to think about. Is that a problem right there? Okay, so now I'm like, hey, well, let's put the cassette player in, or datasette, whatever you want to call it, and I want to turn it on, and I want to look at that pin on the CPU to see what is going on when I hit play, rewind, or fast forward. So you can see here, I'm going to just put the little fluke up, and I'm going to count that pin there, and I'm going to just look, and now we're at 3 volts. So I'm like, okay, 3 volts, and now I'm going to hit rewind, for example, and it goes down. So it goes from high to low voltage. That seems normal to me. I think that's perfectly fine. And if I turn it off again and try it again, yep, back to 3 volts. So I'm pretty sure at this point the CPU is in good shape, which is awesome. And I'm starting to think, okay, let's replace this transistor here and see what happens when I replace that. Okay, so at this point I'm going to go ahead and replace that transistor, and later on I'm going to find out it's a fool's errand, but I'm going to speed this part up and play a little music. So I decided, let me go back to the drawing board and look at the schematics again. So I'm going to look at the right hand of the side of the schematic. The schematics are, in the old days they used to fold out, so it used to be, 2 pages wide. And I'm looking in the top left corner, and I'm looking at capacitor 63, so C63, 1000, and I'm looking at CR4. And I'm thinking that's the 9 volts coming on that side. And then I flipped over to the other side, left side of the schematic, near the cassette port at the top. And I'm looking at, resistor 1, R1, is where that 9 volts unregulated is coming to. So then I thought, well, let me check the continuity between those 2 points and look for voltage coming out of them. So I pulled the board out and I'm checking voltage, and I can see R1 right there. It's not getting any voltage. And I'm like, okay, well, that's a problem right there. And so I'm going to look through and just check different points to see where voltage is and where it isn't. And I can see that this side of the board, right around that voltage regulator, it's not doing what it's supposed to. On the capacitor side, it's good. So it looks like it's just not getting from one side of the board to the other. And the continuity test, it's not really registering correctly. So I think there is some kind of break, or something on the board isn't actually connected from one side. Okay, so now I'm going to basically flip this board over and mark on both sides of the board where it should be, there should be continuity. And then try to figure out if there is a broken trace or some other kind of odd issue going on with it. Because it looks like it's certain parts of the board, the trace is on the bottom of the board, and then it flips over to the top of the board and continues on to the other side. So it's not like a direct, I can't look and see one trace going from one side of the board to the other, which kind of makes perfect sense. So I'm basically going to look through and check the one side and see what I can figure out. So I'm right there, and I'm on that capacitor, and I'm looking, and I can see, okay, we're good so far. And then I know, okay, well, right there, nope, nothing. So definitely a break somewhere. And then I'm kind of looking through, seeing if I can figure out anything. And right about now, I spot the issue. And when I took this RF modulator off, I must have nicked one of the traces. And so that's the problem, because if I go from that point to here, yep, we get connection. And then I'm going to follow that little trace, and it goes across, and it comes to the other point, and yeah, it's not good. But then that point on the other side, it does come across. So I'm basically going to need a jumper wire to fix an issue that I caused originally when I took off that RF modulator. And to be honest, I knew at the time, now that I think about it, that I nicked that trace, but honestly I didn't think it went anywhere, because when I tested the computer, everything seemed to work, and I don't really use the tape drive a whole lot, so I wouldn't really think about it. So in retrospect, I should have, assume that it was doing something. And, but that's the way it is. And also, this board, because of all the damage to it, it's very easy to basically, take a trace out or a pad out. It's very difficult to work on this board.